It began with a discovery so strange and so intimate that it sent shockwaves through Clarence House, a secret that had been hidden not in some far-off palace chamber, but right under the royal family's own roof. Before we dive into this shocking revelation, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the unfolding truth behind the palace walls and the stories the crown never meant for the world to hear. Tonight we uncover how a long overlooked vault, one that everyone thought was harmless, exposed something that would change King Charles's life forever and drag the memory of Diana back into the centre of royal history. For years, whispers floated through the corridors of Clarence House about a private vault belonging to Queen Camilla. It was said to contain personal keepsakes, nothing more than old correspondence, jewellery or heirlooms that had no bearing on the monarchy's public affairs. Even King Charles, aware of its existence, never thought twice about what lay behind that heavy door. It was, after all, Camilla's private space, and out of respect, or perhaps avoidance, he never went further than acknowledging it existed. But all of that changed during a late-night inspection, one that began innocently enough, when staff began cataloguing old possessions and archiving artefacts for preservation. The task was routine. Teams had been moving through the royal residences, identifying, labelling and recording items for historical documentation. When the project reached Clarence House, Charles decided to take a more active role. Perhaps it was nostalgia, perhaps curiosity, or perhaps something deeper. A sense that certain personal pieces of history shouldn't be left to staff alone. Whatever the reason, that decision led him to Camilla's vault, a place he had never personally entered. What he found behind that thick door would leave him pale and speechless. The vault was neatly arranged, each drawer labelled and sealed, each box categorised in the tidy fashion that Camilla preferred. But at the far end, half concealed behind a stack of antique chests, stood something different, a small steel box, plain but unmistakably royal. What caught Charles's eye wasn't its design, but the insignia engraved into the metal, the crest of Princess Diana. His pulse quickened. It was a mark he knew by heart, one that belonged to the woman whose memory still lingered in every corner of his life. At first he thought it must have been a mistake. Perhaps it was an old family item mistakenly stored away. But the more he looked, the less sense it made. Why would anything bearing Diana's personal crest be locked in Camilla's private vault? And more importantly, why had he never been told? He hesitated for a long moment before asking a nearby aide to fetch the key. When the lock clicked open, it was as if a door to the past swung wide. Inside were letters, neatly folded and yellowing with age. There were cassettes, hand-labelled in Diana's familiar handwriting, and notes that appeared to have been written in the years leading up to her death. The air in the room felt heavy as Charles reached for one of the envelopes. The first line he read made his throat tighten. These weren't just letters, they were confessions, fears, unguarded thoughts written by a woman who had once been at the centre of a global storm. Words that had vanished when she did, presumed lost or destroyed. But they had been here all along, waiting in silence. The king's hands trembled as he unfolded each page. The content was raw, deeply emotional, and heartbreakingly honest. Diana had poured her truth into those letters. Her struggles, her loneliness, her sense of betrayal. To read them was to relive a pain that Charles had spent decades trying to bury. What made it worse was the unanswered question pressing at the back of his mind. How did Camilla come to possess them? Had she known they were here? When he finally stepped away from the vault, his face was described by one witness as ashen, drained of all colour and warmth. He gave no orders, spoke no words, only asked for the vault to be sealed and guarded. But news spreads quickly in a house like Clarence. By dawn, whispers were circulating through the staff, and by mid-morning, senior aides were already discussing how to contain what was being quietly described as potentially catastrophic. The documents weren't just relics, they were living echoes of a woman whose story had never truly ended. Their existence threatened to reopen every wound the monarchy had worked to close. The idea that Camilla, even unknowingly, had kept such intimate materials hidden was unthinkable. For the public, it would be unforgivable. And for Charles, it was an emotional labyrinth. Every choice from that moment would carry unbearable weight. There was no official statement that day. The palace remained silent, but inside, chaos brewed. Advisors debated what to do next. Some urged complete discretion. Seal the materials, pretend nothing had happened, protect the institution. Others warned that if even a hint of the discovery leaked, the damage would multiply tenfold. The king, however, remained motionless, trapped between grief and disbelief. For him, this wasn't about politics or reputation. It was about ghosts. He had spent years reshaping his public image, years building peace around a life once defined by heartbreak. But now, the past had broken through the walls he thought would hold it. Those letters, those recordings, weren't just artefacts. They were reminders of promises broken, love lost, and the price of silence. They were the voice of a woman who refused to disappear. even in death. That night, Charles reportedly returned to the vault alone. Whether to reread what he had found or simply to make peace with it, no one knows. But when he emerged, he was described as changed, older, wearier, and carrying the kind of sorrow that no crown could conceal. What began as a simple act of curiosity had become a reckoning. Hidden in plain sight, the truth had waited for its moment. And that moment had finally arrived. The discovery would not stay secret for long. What was found in that vault, and the story behind how it got there, would soon ignite a firestorm that neither Charles nor Camilla could control. The question now wasn't just what the king had found, but what that discovery meant for the future of the monarchy itself.
When the first whispers of the vault's contents reached the upper levels of palace staff, the reaction was instant panic. No one wanted to believe it was true. How could something so sensitive, so personal, have been hidden for so long without anyone noticing? Yet as details trickled out, the reality became impossible to deny. The existence of a sealed steel box marked with Diana's insignia wasn't just a curiosity, it was a crisis waiting to explode. Behind closed doors, aides described the situation as a historical detonation, one that could unravel decades of careful image building with a single headline. Inside Clarence House, the mood shifted from quiet shock to outright alarm. Senior officials met through the night, forming a kind of internal emergency council. Their goal was simple but daunting: contain the fallout before it reached the public. But there was no simple way to contain something that cut so deeply into the royal family's most vulnerable history. The materials in that box weren't political documents or administrative files, they were emotional landmines. Every letter, every note written in Diana's unmistakable hand carried the power to reopen old wounds that had never truly healed. The king's private secretary reportedly pleaded with him to surrender the box immediately to palace archives, to keep it out of sight and out of circulation. But Charles resisted. For him, this was no longer about procedure. It was personal, painfully so. The letters represented a part of his life that had been left unresolved, a connection to a woman he had loved, lost, and ultimately wronged. Some insiders claimed that Charles spent hours alone reading each letter, quietly absorbing every word until dawn. What he read there, they said, left him silent and deeply shaken. One document in particular was said to stand out, a long, handwritten message written not long before Diana's final trip abroad. The tone was intimate but haunting, filled with reflections on trust, fear, and the feeling of being watched. To Charles, it was a reminder of how far things had spiraled, and how little peace had come from all the years since. It was the past speaking to him again, in her voice, as if time itself refused to move on. By the following morning, the weight of what he had found began to seep into every decision he made. He cancelled planned appearances, turned down meetings, and instructed aides to restrict access to Clarence House. Meanwhile, rumors began spreading beyond the palace walls. It started with a whisper to a trusted journalist, then another leak from a staff member who couldn't keep the secret any longer. By the time the tabloids caught wind of it, the story was unstoppable. Hidden vault in Clarence House holds Diana's lost letters was the headline that started it all. It hit the morning papers like a thunderclap. Within hours, news channels and social media were consumed by speculation. Was it true? How did Camilla come to possess such personal items? What did the letters say? Theories multiplied, each more dramatic than the last. Some accused the palace of covering up years of secrets. Others believed it was a deliberate act of preservation gone wrong. Whatever the truth, the public outrage was immediate. For millions of people, the idea that Diana's private writings had been locked away, out of sight and out of mind, was intolerable. She had always been the people's princess, someone whose voice, honesty, and vulnerability had made her beloved around the world. To imagine those same words hidden in a vault belonging to the woman who had once been her greatest rival felt like betrayal. Social media lit up with anger and heartbreak. Old wounds reopened overnight, and public sympathy once again tilted sharply toward Diana's memory. The palace tried to contain the storm, releasing a carefully worded statement about personal items recently recovered and under review. But it only fueled speculation further. The public wanted answers, and every vague response only deepened suspicion. Analysts described the unfolding situation as the most emotionally charged crisis the royal household had faced in years. And at its center were two figures, Charles and Camilla, each struggling under the unbearable pressure of history catching up with them. Camilla, sources said, was blindsided. She reportedly denied any knowledge of what had been inside the vault, insisting she believed it contained old correspondence and estate records. But the damage was done. Even those close to her struggled to defend the oversight. How could such a sensitive collection end up in her possession without her knowledge? The optics were impossible to ignore. Publicly, she withdrew, cancelling appearances, avoiding cameras, and issuing no personal comment. Privately, those who saw her said she appeared shaken, distraught, and terrified of what might come next. For Charles, the crisis was more than political, it was moral. He faced an agonizing dilemma: defend his wife or confront the truth of what she had unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, kept hidden. Each choice came with consequences that threatened the very foundation of their marriage and the monarchy's already fragile reputation. Behind the palace gates, he was said to be consumed by guilt. It wasn't just about the discovery itself, but what it represented. The ghost of the past had returned, and this time, it demanded to be heard. Outside the palace, the world watched with fascination and fury. The rediscovery of Diana's letters reignited a collective memory of loss, compassion, and unresolved injustice. It was no longer just a royal scandal, it was a cultural reckoning. People began asking what else had been hidden, what other truths had been buried under the weight of royal discretion. And as the days went by, one thing became clear: this wasn't going away. The vault had been opened, and so had the floodgates of history. By the end of that week, pressure on the king reached a breaking point. Advisors warned that silence was no longer an option. Something had to be done to restore control, or at least the appearance of it. But how do you control a story that touches the deepest corners of human emotion, love, and loss? As one palace insider put it, you can manage a rumor. You can deny a report. But you can't silence the voice of the past. The days that followed were some of the most turbulent Clarence House had seen in decades. Every newspaper, every talk show, every headline seemed to revolve around one question: how could something as personal and sacred as Diana's private letters end up hidden in a vault belonging to Camilla? For the monarchy, this wasn't just a scandal, it was an existential crisis that tore open the emotional fault lines that had never truly healed since Diana's passing. The storm outside the palace walls grew louder by the hour. Protesters gathered near royal estates, holding signs bearing Diana's image. Online, millions shared clips of her old interviews, her public appearances, her words about love, betrayal, and vulnerability. It was as though the world had been transported back in time, back to the same emotional divide that once consumed Britain. Every photograph of Camilla that surfaced became a lightning rod for criticism, and every silence from Charles was treated as confirmation of guilt. The past had not only returned, it had taken center stage once again. Inside Clarence House, the atmosphere was suffocating. Advisors walked on eggshells, fearing that even the smallest misstep could trigger another wave of outrage. The king was rarely seen in public, and when he did appear, his demeanor was solemn, distant, and heavy with fatigue. According to one staff member, he spent hours pacing the corridors late into the night, often retreating into the same room where the vault had been discovered. It had become a place of both torment and reflection, a physical reminder of everything he wished he could forget. Camilla, meanwhile, had effectively vanished from sight. For someone accustomed to a tight but active schedule of public engagements, her sudden absence was glaring. Events were quietly cancelled or postponed. Charities she patronized released neutral statements about temporary scheduling adjustments. Behind the scenes, she was reportedly in tears, pleading to explain her side of the story. Those closest to her said she felt trapped, vilified by the public, misunderstood by history, and isolated even within her own home. The palace's press team advised against any direct comment, fearing that anything she said could be twisted or weaponized. But silence, as it turned out, was just as dangerous. The longer the palace said nothing, the more the narrative spiraled out of control. Tabloids began publishing speculative accounts of what might have been in the box: love letters, confessions, recordings, fueling the belief that something truly explosive had been found. The truth, of course, was far more tragic than sensational. The materials weren't about scandal, they were about sorrow. They were the reflections of a woman who felt unseen and unheard, whose honesty now echoed louder than ever. But that nuance was lost amid the noise. The public didn't see private pain, they saw betrayal. King Charles found himself in a moral bind unlike anything he had ever faced. On one hand, he understood the public's grief. Diana had meant something far greater than royal glamour. She had been a symbol of humanity within a system built on restraint. Her letters, filled with raw emotion, only deepened that connection. On the other hand, he was bound by duty to protect the monarchy, to ensure that personal matters didn't consume the institution. Yet no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't separate the two. Diana's story was his story, and now, it was Camilla's as well. Behind closed doors, a quiet but intense argument reportedly unfolded between Charles and his advisors. Some urged him to make a televised statement, an acknowledgement of what had been found, paired with an assurance that the items were being treated with care. Others warned that doing so would only keep the story alive and invite further scrutiny. For days, the debate raged on, until Charles finally made his decision. The materials would be sealed once more and transferred to royal custody for formal preservation. Nothing would be destroyed, but nothing would be made public either. That decision, though careful, only fueled more speculation. Critics accused the king of hiding the truth once again, while supporters argued that he was right to protect something so deeply personal. But for Charles, it wasn't about optics, it was about responsibility. Those letters were more than relics. They were the voice of a woman he could never truly make peace with. He had already failed her once. To mishandle her words now would be unforgivable. Even as he made that choice, the emotional toll became visible. He appeared drawn, pale, and exhausted in the few official appearances he couldn't cancel. When he spoke to the public, his voice carried a tremor of weariness, the kind that comes from carrying a weight too heavy for too long. Aides described him as haunted by memories, by guilt, by the realization that no matter how far he moved forward, the past was never really gone. Inside the palace, some staff members began to refer to it in hushed tones as the reckoning. It wasn't an official term, but it captured the feeling perfectly. This wasn't just a media scandal. It was the universe demanding that unfinished business be faced. The vault had been more than a physical place. It had been a metaphor for everything the royal family had buried. Now that it was open, nothing could be neatly closed again. By the end of that week, even the most loyal aides began to fear for the king's health. The stress was visible, the sleeplessness undeniable. He had aged what seemed like years in mere days. One insider recalled seeing him standing alone by the window of his study, holding one of Diana's letters, staring out into the gardens without speaking for nearly an hour. Whatever words passed through his mind in that silence, no one would ever know. But those who witnessed it said it was the image of a man coming to terms with the one truth he had spent his life avoiding, that some ghosts never rest. The crisis wasn't over, not by a long shot. The media's appetite for the story was only growing, and the emotional ripples within the family were starting to fracture relationships that were already fragile. The discovery of that steel box had set in motion something irreversible, something that no crown or title could contain. And soon, it wouldn't just be the king and queen caught in the fallout. Others in the royal circle were about to take a stand, each with their own idea of what should happen next. The silence inside Clarence House couldn't last forever. The moment came when the private crisis became a family one, when the weight of what had been found began to ripple outward and pull others into its orbit. The discovery of Diana's letters was no longer just a matter of royal protocol or public relations. It had become personal, painfully so, for those whose lives were forever shaped by her absence. And at the center of that storm stood Prince William. For William, the news of the vault's contents was more than just shocking. It was deeply personal, almost unbearable. When he first learned of the discovery, insiders say he didn't believe it. The very idea that his late mother's private letters and recordings had been hidden for so long, in a vault belonging to someone else, was beyond comprehension. At first, he demanded proof. But when he was shown the evidence, the photographs, the handwritten pages, it all became horrifyingly real. The pain he'd buried since childhood surged back with a force that shook him to his core. To the world, William had long represented composure, the steady, dignified heir who would someday lead with calm restraint. But behind closed doors, this revelation tore through him. He was said to be furious, not only at the existence of the vault but at the secrecy that surrounded it. Why had no one told him sooner? Why had these letters been kept hidden? And how had they ended up in Camilla's possession at all? Those questions burned in his mind as he confronted his father in what multiple sources described as one of the most emotionally charged conversations in years. The discussion, according to those close to the family, lasted hours. Raised voices were heard behind closed doors. William demanded accountability, insisting that the items be immediately removed from Camilla's vault and placed under his supervision. He argued that his mother's memory belonged not to the institution, but to her children. Charles, shaken and torn, tried to reason with him, explaining that he hadn't known what was inside until the moment he opened it himself. But to William, that explanation wasn't enough. The emotional wound was too deep. What made the confrontation even more painful was the unspoken history between father and son. Diana's shadow had always lingered in their relationship, a silent third presence that neither could ever fully escape. This discovery brought all of that history crashing back to the surface. William wasn't just speaking as a son, he was speaking as the guardian of his mother's legacy. And to him, allowing those letters to remain in anyone else's hands was unthinkable. Eventually, Charles agreed. The contents of the vault would be handed over and secured under royal supervision, to be reviewed only by a small, trusted circle. But the tension between them didn't fade, it only deepened. For Charles, the act was one of respect, a gesture of closure. For William, it was a reclamation, a son taking back what never should have been lost in the first place. Behind the palace walls, the dynamic between father and son shifted in ways few had anticipated. Courtiers described an air of frost between them, polite in public but distant in private. Charles, weighed down by guilt, sought to mend the rift, but William's trust had been shaken. He couldn't understand how something so sacred could have been mishandled, even unintentionally. To him, this wasn't just about lost letters. It was about everything that had gone wrong decades ago, everything his mother had endured, and the belief that the institution had failed her then, and perhaps again now. As the press continued to circle like vultures, the story took on a new dimension. Reporters began speculating about a royal divide, describing William as determined, uncompromising, and fiercely protective of Diana's image. The narrative painted Charles as conflicted, torn between loyalty to his wife and a desperate need to repair his bond with his son. And at the heart of it all was Camilla, now isolated, portrayed as both the cause and the casualty of a scandal that refused to fade. Inside Clarence House, Camilla's world had shrunk to a few rooms and a handful of confidants. She was reportedly devastated by William's anger, describing it as the final blow after weeks of public vilification. Friends said she broke down more than once, repeating that she hadn't known the letters were there. But no one was listening anymore, not the press, not the public, and certainly not Diana's eldest son. To most, her explanations sounded hollow. The optics were too damning, and sympathy was in short supply. Charles, caught between two worlds, tried to find a path forward. He reached out privately to William, asking for a truce, suggesting they focus on safeguarding Diana's writings rather than fighting over them. But the emotional damage was done. William had already instructed palace archivists to seal the materials under his direction, ensuring that nothing could be altered or destroyed. For him, this wasn't about revenge, it was about protecting the truth. Whatever Diana had written, whatever pain she had recorded, he believed it deserved to remain untouched and preserved exactly as she intended. The symbolic weight of that decision was enormous. It meant that the late princess's voice would live on, unfiltered and unedited, beyond the reach of those who had once tried to manage her story. It was, in a sense, her final victory, the return of her narrative to her own bloodline. And for many around the world, it felt like a kind of justice. But for Charles and Camilla, it was devastating. Their attempts to heal old wounds had been undone by the ghosts of the past. Every attempt at progress now felt hollow, overshadowed by the spectre of a woman whose presence still defined them both. The monarchy had faced scandals before, but this was different. It wasn't about politics or protocol. It was about emotion, memory, and love. It was about the inescapable truth that history cannot be rewritten, no matter how carefully it's locked away. By the time the media frenzy began to cool, the damage was done. The royal family's image had taken another blow, and inside the palace, the emotional fractures remained raw and unhealed. William had reclaimed his mother's legacy, but at a cost, one that left his father emotionally shattered and his stepmother isolated. What had begun as a simple archival effort had turned into a reckoning, forcing the family to confront what they had long avoided: the power of truth and the pain it can bring when it finally comes to light. Still, as the dust settled, one thing became clear: the vault had been opened, but its impact was far from over. The discovery had changed everything, and for the royal family, there would be no going back to the way things were before. The world had seen behind the curtain, and the past, once buried, was now speaking louder than ever. The scandal surrounding the vault might have begun with a single discovery, but by now, it had evolved into something far more profound: a confrontation with legacy itself. What was once whispered behind palace walls had become a public spectacle, and the emotional fallout left deep cracks not only within the royal household but in the way the world viewed them. Every action taken, every silence maintained, was being dissected under an unforgiving lens. But amid all the chaos, one truth lingered above all: Diana's presence, even in absence, had never been stronger. For Charles, the aftermath was a descent into quiet torment. The initial shock had long passed, replaced now by an aching regret that gnawed at him with every passing day. Those close to him said he spoke little, that his once meticulous schedule of briefings, engagements, and meetings had been reduced to the bare essentials. When he did speak, his words carried the tone of a man haunted not only by what was discovered but by what it represented. The vault, once a secret corner of the house, had become a mirror reflecting everything he wished he could undo. He knew that his reign, his legacy, would now be forever tied to this discovery. No matter how much good he did for the nation or how diligently he served, this chapter would always linger in the public memory. The world had seen not the stoic monarch, but the man behind the crown, a husband conflicted, a father burdened, and a figure still shadowed by the past. In the public eye, Diana's voice had returned to reclaim its place in the royal narrative, and there was nothing he could do to silence it. Nor did he truly want to. Those who knew Charles best said he spent his evenings rereading the recovered letters, one by one, often pausing for long stretches as though speaking silently to the woman who wrote them. Some nights, he would stop midway through a line and simply stare into the fire, lost in thought. It wasn't guilt alone, it was grief, layered with the realization that no matter how much time had passed, Diana's story had never been properly concluded. She had become immortal in her own way, through her words, her spirit, and now, through the rediscovery of her private truths. Meanwhile, Camilla's retreat from public life deepened. She had faced criticism before, she had endured decades of public disapproval and learned to live under the constant weight of comparison, but this was different. The outrage wasn't just about perception, it was about possession. In the eyes of the public, she had trespassed on sacred ground, even if unintentionally. The thought that Diana's personal letters and recordings had sat behind her locked door, even in ignorance, felt to many like a symbolic betrayal too great to forgive. Within the palace, sympathy toward her had all but vanished. Advisors were cautious, polite, but distant. Some even suggested she temporarily move out of Clarence House to allow the tension to cool, but she refused. To her, leaving would be an admission of guilt, a public surrender she could never recover from. Still, her isolation grew unbearable. Once lively dinners had turned into quiet, separate meals. She rarely left her quarters and declined visits from old friends who tried to comfort her. It was as though the vault had swallowed her too, trapping her in a cycle of shame and misunderstanding. And outside, the world wasn't ready to move on. Every day, new opinion pieces surfaced, each dissecting the implications of the vault and what it symbolized. For many, it became a metaphor for everything they believed about the monarchy itself, a place where secrets festered, where emotion was suppressed, and where history was controlled rather than remembered. Others, however, saw something far more human, a family struggling with love, loss, and the weight of a legacy that refused to fade. Television specials began revisiting Diana's life, replaying old footage that once captivated the world. The public relived the magic, the tragedy, and the authenticity that made her unforgettable. Her words from decades ago, about compassion, honesty, and vulnerability, resonated anew. It was as though her rediscovered letters had breathed new life into the myth, turning her into more than a historical figure. She had become a symbol again, a reminder of truth in an era of image. The monarchy tried to adapt. Quiet discussions were held about how to reshape public perception, how to redirect attention back toward duty and service. But nothing seemed to work. The vault's discovery had rewritten the emotional landscape. It had exposed the one thing the monarchy had always avoided showing: its humanity, raw and unfiltered. And while that might have been devastating for its image, it also made it impossible to look away. The story didn't just captivate, it haunted. Charles, in his solitude, began to see the event not merely as a scandal but as a reckoning he had long avoided. For years, he had tried to compartmentalize his life, the past in one box, the present in another, but life had forced those walls to collapse. The vault was a literal manifestation of that truth. No matter how tightly you seal something, the past finds its way out. And in this case, it had done so in the most painful way imaginable. As time passed, he made one quiet, private decision. He instructed that the vault be emptied and converted into something entirely different, not a storage space, but a memorial room. It would hold no secrets, no personal relics, no reminders of hidden pain. Instead, it would be a place of reflection, lined with art and books, open only to family. Whether this was an act of redemption, remembrance, or resignation, no one could say. But it was his way of ensuring that the vault, once a symbol of concealment, would never again represent silence. For William, the transformation meant little. His relationship with his father remained strained, though less visibly hostile. He had taken possession of his mother's materials, keeping them locked away under strict preservation guidelines. No one outside a select few had seen them since. But for him, the knowledge that they were safe, that her words could never again be hidden or misplaced, was enough. And so the vault that began as a private mystery had become something larger, a story about truth, time, and the unshakable power of memory. What was found inside may have belonged to the past, but its consequences were shaping the future. The monarchy had been reminded of something it often tried to forget, that even the strongest institutions are built on fragile human hearts, and when those hearts break, their echoes can last for generations. The walls of Clarence House still stood, silent as ever. But within them, something fundamental had changed. The secrets were gone, the ghosts unmasked, and though the family tried to move forward, the truth had already left its mark. And for those who looked closely enough, they could see it in the king's eyes, a quiet acceptance that some burdens are never lifted. Some are simply learned to be carried. In the months that followed, Clarence House settled into an uneasy calm, but beneath the surface, nothing was truly the same. The vault's discovery had become more than a fleeting scandal. It was a turning point, a moment when the boundaries between the past and present had finally collapsed. The royal family, for all its grandeur and formality, had been forced to confront something deeply human, the truth that history cannot be locked away, and that even the most private secrets eventually demand to be seen. King Charles, though he resumed public duties, was no longer the same man he had been before that night. Those close to him said the change was subtle but profound, a certain stillness in his demeanor, a quietness behind his words. He was polite as ever, dutiful as always, but his spirit carried the unmistakable weight of reflection. The vault, the letters, and the ghost of the woman who once shared his life had altered him in ways no one could have predicted. It was as if he had crossed an invisible threshold between duty and reckoning, between the man he was and the man history would remember. He rarely spoke about what had happened. When the subject arose in conversation, he would only nod and shift the topic to work, or quietly walk away. But those who spent time with him noticed that his perspective had softened. His decisions became more personal, his tone more contemplative. For a man who had lived much of his life under the pressure of image and expectation, it seemed the vault had broken something open inside him, a realization that no legacy, no crown, could outlast the truth of emotion. Camilla, on the other hand, struggled to find her footing again. Though she eventually returned to public life, her appearances carried a tension that hadn't been there before. The confidence that once defined her presence had dimmed, replaced by careful restraint. The public's reaction had scarred her reputation in ways she could never fully mend, and though she tried to carry on, the shadow of the vault followed her wherever she went. In her private moments, she was said to feel as though the walls around her had become thinner, as though every glance and whisper hid a judgment she could no longer escape. Her friends described her as quieter, more withdrawn, and at times, deeply remorseful, not for something she had done intentionally, but for the chain of pain that the discovery had unleashed. She had always believed she could coexist with the memory of Diana, that the years of distance and service had finally built a fragile peace between the past and the present. But the vault shattered that illusion. It reminded her, and the world, that some stories never end neatly, that love and loss leave marks that no time can erase. For William, the experience hardened his resolve. As guardian of his mother's recovered writings, he took the responsibility with solemn seriousness. The materials were sealed under strict archival care, their contents known only to a trusted handful. But the weight of them, knowing what those pages contained, seemed to linger in his posture and expression. He became more protective, more careful about the image of his mother's memory, as though defending her honor had become not just a duty, but a mission. Those close to him say he often reread her words late at night, not out of obsession, but out of a desire for connection, to understand her not as a public figure, but as the woman she truly was. Each letter, each recording, was like a window into the heart of the mother he lost too soon. And though the pain of what he had learned through the vault was immense, it also gave him something he had long sought, closure, however imperfect. As the months turned to a year, the media moved on to other stories, and the scandal faded from the headlines. But the consequences remained etched in the hearts of those it touched. Inside the royal family, the vault had become a silent symbol, a reminder of the fragility of secrecy and the endurance of truth. The family learned to coexist with it, much like one learns to live with an old wound. It may stop bleeding, but the scar never disappears. Behind closed doors, Charles commissioned one final act of quiet reconciliation. He ordered that a single inscription be placed within the newly transformed chamber where the vault had once stood. It was simple, just a line engraved in polished brass, positioned where the steel box had been found. Truth endures where silence once stood. No one outside the family was told of the inscription, and it was never made public. But for those who knew, it was clear what it meant. It wasn't a statement for the world, it was a message for himself, for Camilla, for William, and perhaps most of all, for Diana. It was the king's acknowledgement that no matter how far he had come, his life, and his legacy, would always be intertwined with hers. The world would remember Diana as it always had, radiant, tragic, human. Her story, once buried, had been brought back to light not by intention but by fate. And through that rediscovery, she had done in death what she so often did in life: remind those around her of the power of honesty, the danger of silence, and the enduring strength of love. In the end, the vault at Clarence House became more than just a room. It became a symbol of everything hidden and revealed, everything loved and lost. It stood as a quiet testament to the truth that no matter how tightly one guards the past, it always finds a way to surface. And for a royal family built on ceremony and secrecy, that truth was both humbling and transformative. As Charles walked those corridors now, he did so with a slower step, carrying not just the weight of a crown, but the knowledge that every legacy, his, hers, theirs, was built not on what was hidden, but on what endured. In that realization lay both his burden and his redemption. And so, behind the grand facade of Clarence House, the past finally rested, not forgotten, but accepted. The vault was gone, but what it revealed would echo through generations, reminding all who came after that even in the quietest corners of power, truth has a heartbeat of its own.